Well, Ansgar Graw in Berlin, the president has said several times today that he wants to provide millions of dollars in recovery for Louisiana next door, but of course most especially for Texas, which has been hardest hit by Hurricane Harvey so far. He's going to have to work with the Congress, isn't he, to get that. Do you see any problems there, bearing in mind you covered the White House for so long and have only recently returned to Germany?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there is some tension between the White House and especially President Trump himself and the Congress. But I think in this specific case, in the question of helping Texas and Louisiana, I think the Congress will help, will open the budgets and will give the money, since that's not a question of politics, that's a question of help in an emergency case. And therefore, I would totally agree. There were many cases when the president didn't react in an appropriate way, but this time he reacted very fast. He went to the area, not in the epicenter, and that was correct, not disturbing the first responders. And therefore, I think he made everything right. Nevertheless, the perception of President Trump is so bad, so unpopular, for example, in Europe, that most media didn't discuss what the president did today, but they discussed whether it was right or wrong that First Lady Melania started in high heels when they went to Texas. That's totally unimportantly, it's a nullity, but nevertheless, this nullity was discussed, and when they landed, in the end, everybody was happy that she left the airplane or the helicopter with sneakers, and therefore everything was fine. But yes, that shows how complicated the relation from the public, also in Europe and in Germany, towards the president is right now.
Dan Perkins in Florida, he's getting kudos from cable TV for doing the right thing at last, a chance to reset maybe. He didn't meet anybody, though, as far as I know, who was actually directly affected. It was all officials. Do you think he should have done?
I think he did exactly what he would do. You know, there were people who were wondering after Mr. Trump was elected president and sworn in, generally speaking, it is some kind of an emergency that either defines or destroys a president. And we had this situation, if you remember, in Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, when Bush 43 took a lot of heat for his inattention. I think that the President Trump and his staff were very much aware of what was going on and what could happen, and they were prepared with FEMA and Homeland Security. And so the cable networks and the mainstream networks really didn't have anything to criticize. And I find it ironic that the international media is focusing on her shoes as opposed to what the president is trying to do. And I just find it amazing. You know, here we had, over the weekend, we had the Washington Post and one of the New York magazines say that perhaps Mr. Trump was right when he talked that multiple sides were involved in Charlottesville, and that AFTA is a bad organization. So that for the Washington Times and the New Yorker magazine to recognize that and give him credit for that stand, I'm wondering if the American media is beginning to understand that this man can be president, and his first test wasn't nuclear war, but what are we going to do to save the people in Houston and all the rest of Texas? Joe, President Trump has always insisted, as you know only too well, that the media misrepresented what he said about race in Charlottesville. And
well, he didn't misrepresent what he said about race. Let me tell you one thing, as someone who is an activist and has seen the sides. First of all, let's get this stuff. Alt-right is nothing more than a nice way of saying that someone is a neo-Nazi is a white nationalist and a Ku Klux Klanner. And darn it, I'm not going to sit up here and change up words just to whitewash these individuals. Number two, anybody who is decent does not show up on the side of people carrying torches and talking about Jews and blacks and Mexicans. If you are decent, you end up on the other side of the street. And number three, I've been involved with, because this other group that we all of a sudden are hearing about, I've been involved in demonstrations where we better check and see who's financing these folks. Isn't it interesting that nobody has interviewed a single member of this group to find out how are they financed, who are they, where did they come from? Because I am familiar with what they call gang, counter-gang strategy, which is used globally around the world. So let us be very careful. And as someone once said, Donald Trump may not be a racist, but he sure has a lot of racist friends.
Dan Perkins?
Well, if you just do a little research, you can find out a lot about this organization. Antifa calls itself an anarchist organization which is against the Constitution and free speech.
And so are the people who demonstrated, that are against my constitutional rights to exist in the United States. You know, sometimes you can be so far to the left that you meet the right.
Well, I would say to you that I am concerned that we have an organization who is out there, and if you begin to go back and look at all the way back in the Trump campaign rallies, and you look at what happened in Berkeley the first time, all of a sudden you begin to see that Antifa is in all these places, and they're wearing black and they're wearing masks to hide their identity, and they're attacking people. Wow. When you look at what happened when we had the demonstration in Boston, what did the mayor tweet out? He tweeted out that he wished that the protesters on the left, the Antifas, would stop throwing bags of rocks and bottles of urine at his police force.
Yeah, and if you go to some of the Trump rallies, you can also see people who punch demonstrators in the face, and a presidential candidate who says, "Get them out of here, I'll pay for your lawyer if you get arrested."
Afshin, have the last word on this topic.
Sure. I mean, no, I think it's appropriate for the news media to look at Antifa. This is an organization that shows up not only at these kind of rallies, but has been showing up at World Trade Organization events, World Bank, IMF events. They are anarchists. They're generally, you know, they don't have a positive vision of the world. Having said that, when the President of the United States sees what happens in Charlottesville, his first reaction should be to unite the country. His first reaction should not be in any semblance of moral equivalence. You can get into the details later of who was throwing what at who and all that sort of thing, but I think this president failed the presidential test when it came to Charlottesville. And I'm not alone in saying that. A lot of Republicans felt that way as well.
Let's move on to Joe Arpaio, who is a sheriff in the state of Arizona, who ignored the rulings of at least 2 judges to stop profiling Hispanic people in Arizona, who he decided of his own volition may be illegal immigrants, and he rounded them up, and he kept doing it, even though at least 2 judges told him not to do so. Joe, the president is within his rights, completely within his rights, in fact, to pardon Joe Arpaio. What do you think about the fact that he did it?
He is within his right. There's no ifs, ands, buts about it.
What do you think about the fact that he did it on the eve of Hurricane Harvey coming in?
Before I go with, I don't know. I mean, that is strategy that you know, most politicians would go through. But here's the point that we need to understand. Our international audience needs to understand this. There is a process. Right. And usually the process is that you get a recommendation, usually from 2 senators or members of Congress. That then goes to the Justice Department. The Justice Department then looks at the issue and then makes a recommendation to the President of the United States. Now, that is the process. Now, does the President have to follow that process? Obviously, he didn't choose to, and that's why you had 2 senators who refused. But let's understand what this man did. Speaking of constitutional rights, he violated the constitutional rights of potentially American citizens who were stopped and profiled because they were brown. This is Chinese television. Imagine if a group of Chinese Americans were riding in a car and then the Arpaio decided to stop them simply because they look Chinese. And here's the other thing to take into consideration, that before he ignored 2 court rulings, federal court rulings, he also ended up having that county pay out $128 million in judgments against him.
Okay.
So, you know, and then he ended up, of course, being defeated in his recent election.
Ansgar, in Berlin, President Obama also made some controversial pardons, didn't he? Including Oscar Lopez Rivera, who was sent to jail for terrorist activities in Puerto Rico. And that became such a new story in New York that he was at the head of the Puerto Rican parade this year, and the mayor refused to be anywhere near the head float. So all presidents do this, don't they?
Mm-hmm. All presidents do this. I think the specific problem in this case is that Donald Trump and Sheriff Arpaio were longtime allies, and not in regard to the immigration policy, but in regard to the birthers controversy. And 5-6 years ago, when Sheriff Arpaio tried to convince the public that President Trump wasn't born in the United States, but was born in Africa. Donald Trump, back then an entrepreneur, made promotion for Sheriff Arpaio. And in this actual time, he gave signals very early that he would pardon Sheriff Arpaio.
Okay.
And I think that's a problem, that he tried to help a long-time ally, and that seems to me a signal that President Trump isn't accepting the division of power, and
Okay.
that's a problem.
Dan Perkins, fairly briefly, if you would. He is the law and order president, so say. Is this not a mark against him?
No, you just had one of the other panelists say that Sheriff Arpaio arrested people who might be eventually American citizens who had violated the law as far as illegal immigration. They'd committed a felony. And so you can't just say, well, the law doesn't count. It only counts when a particular judge. If we have laws on the book that deal with immigration and illegal immigration, and we have a law enforcement officer enforcing the law, that's what he's supposed to do.
That's not, nobody said he was, no, that's not, no, excuse me, let's be very accurate. What he was found guilty of was profiling people who had not committed a crime by 2 judges. Now let's be accurate here. These weren't always people who were committing crimes. And I'm one, if you commit a crime, I don't care what color you are. You know, you need to go to jail, be tried, and convicted if found guilty. That's not what he was judged against. He was judged for racial profiling.
And that is true, but it may also be true that the Obama administration moved against the sheriff, didn't they, on the eve of an election, which the current president says he was likely to have won. Is there any sense of any kind of witch hunt by the Obama administration against Sheriff Arpaio because they didn't like him?
Well, it certainly, I mean, he didn't adhere to, President Obama's, worldview. But I think, what Joe is saying is right. I mean, there was, instances of racial profiling in 2 judges, right?
2 federal judges.
2 federal judges pointed that out. But the other thing is that
one was appointed by a Republican.
Well, let me stop you. How might it have been dealt with? How would it have been better to have been dealt with, for example, starting with the Obama administration?
Well, I think, if you look at it with the Obama administration, I think if we want to relitigate that,
just briefly.
Briefly, I think the way the Obama administration ended it, I think it was appropriate. I mean, I think that whenever you racially profile someone like that, I think and it went through the courts. I think this point here is that you didn't have this process play itself out. And the other thing that when you look at this, Sheriff Arpaio also campaigned with Donald Trump. Right. So it smells a little worse when you have someone campaigning with you and doing what he did.
Well, welcome to politics in America.
That's right. And that is an appropriate note to end the show on, I think. Yes, Afshin, Joe, Ansgar, and Dan, thank you very much for your excellent contributions to our program today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.